When David Stormwind first laid eyes on the pale figure crouched naked among the wolf pack in that Dakota Territory canyon, drinking from the stream like the wild animals that had raised her for 18 years, he knew he was witnessing something that would either make him question his sanity or change the course of two lives forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Badlands when David first heard the howling that didn't quite sound like any wolf song he'd known in his 34 years living between two worlds. As a man of mixed Dakota and Scottish heritage, David had learned to read the language of the wilderness from his grandmother's people while understanding the ways of the white settlers from his father's side. But this sound, echoing from the Red Rock Canyons near what the settlers called Devil's Gulch, carried something different, something almost human that made the hair on his arms stand on end.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
David had been tracking a wounded deer for the better part of 3 hours following a blood trail that led deeper into the maze of canyons and rock formations that most folks avoided. The Badlands were treacherous territory, filled with hidden crevices that could swallow a horse and rider whole, flash flood channels that could turn deadly in minutes, and caves where mountain lions made their dens. But David knew these lands better than most, having spent his childhood learning their secrets from his Dakota grandmother before the reservations changed everything. The blood trail had gone cold near a natural spring that bubbled up from underground limestone, creating a small oasis in the harsh landscape where cottonwood trees provided shade and grass grew thick enough to feed wildlife. David dismounted from his paint horse, Thunder, and knelt beside the spring to study the tracks in the soft mud. What he found there made him question everything he thought he knew about the creatures that inhabited these remote canyons. Mixed among the deer tracks and the expected paw prints of wolves were footprints that looked disturbingly human. But they were wrong somehow, too wide and flat, with toes spread in a way that suggested someone who had never worn shoes. The prints were small, clearly female, and they moved in a pattern that followed the wolf tracks so closely it seemed as if whoever made them was part of the pack rather than a separate entity. David had heard stories, of course, whispered around campfires and in the smoky saloons of Deadwood, about children who had disappeared into the wilderness and been raised by animals. Tall tales, most folks said, the kind of stories that grew wilder with each telling. But as he studied those impossible footprints in the mud, David remembered his grandmother's words about the spirits that dwelt in the hidden places of the world, beings that existed between the human and animal realms. The sound came again, closer this time, and David quickly led Thunder behind a boulder outcropping where they would be concealed from whatever was approaching the spring. He checked his Winchester rifle, more out of habit than any real expectation of needing it, and settled down to wait. In his years as a scout for wagon trains and occasional guide for wealthy Eastern hunters, David had learned that patience was often the difference between success and failure, between understanding and ignorance. What emerged from the canyon shadows 20 minutes later challenged every assumption David had made about the natural order of things. The wolf pack came. First, 6 magnificent gray wolves led by a massive alpha male whose silver coat gleamed in the morning sunlight. But moving among them, as natural as breathing, was a young woman who looked to be in her late teens or early 20s. She was completely naked, her pale skin bronzed by years of sun exposure, but marked with scars that told stories of survival in the harshest conditions imaginable. Her hair was white blonde, tangled with burrs and small braids that contained feathers and colored stones in patterns that seemed almost ceremonial. She moved on all fours with the fluid grace of a predator, her muscles lean and powerful from a lifetime of keeping pace with the wolves that had clearly accepted her as one of their own. David watched in stunned silence as the pack approached the spring to drink, the woman positioning herself downstream from the alpha male in what was clearly an established hierarchy. She cupped water in her hands and lapped at it like the wolves, but her movements retained an unmistakably human intelligence that created an eerie contrast with her animal behavior. When one of the younger wolves playfully nipped at her shoulder, she responded with a growling sound that was answered by the entire pack. The woman's senses were clearly as acute as those of her adopted family. Halfway through drinking, she suddenly raised her head and looked directly at the boulder where David was hiding, her pale blue eyes scanning the landscape with an alertness that made his breath catch in his throat. For a moment, their gazes met across the spring, and David saw intelligence in those eyes that was undeniably human, despite the wild circumstances of their meeting. She didn't flee immediately, which surprised David given what must have been her complete lack of exposure to humans for most of her life. Instead, she studied him with the careful assessment of a predator evaluating a potential threat, her head tilted in a way that reminded him of the wolves she lived with. The alpha male had also noticed David's presence and positioned himself protectively between the hidden man and the strange pack member he clearly considered under his protection. David made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Moving slowly and deliberately, he stepped out from behind the boulder, with his hands clearly visible and empty, making himself vulnerable in a way that he hoped would communicate peaceful intentions. The wolves immediately went into defensive postures, the alpha male's hackles rising as he prepared to defend his pack. But the woman raised one hand in a gesture that seemed to calm them. She spoke to the wolves then, not in words, but in a complex series of growls, whines, and body movements that they clearly understood. The pack gradually relaxed their aggressive stances, but remained alert, ready to attack if the strange human proved threatening. The woman herself remained crouched by the water, studying David with an intensity that made him feel as if he were being evaluated by a force of nature rather than a person. David knew enough about animal behavior to understand that sudden movements or aggressive gestures would likely provoke an attack that he couldn't possibly survive. 6 wolves led by a protective alpha were more than capable of killing an armed man, especially one who refused to harm what was clearly a human being caught in impossible circumstances. Instead, he slowly knelt by the spring about 20 feet upstream from the pack and began to drink in the same manner the woman had used. The gesture seemed to communicate something important to her, perhaps indicating that he understood and respected the protocols of her world. She watched him drink, her expression shifting from wariness to curiosity, and David caught glimpses of the human intelligence that existed beneath her wild exterior. When he had finished drinking, he sat back on his heels and waited, making no move that could be interpreted as threatening. What happened next would haunt David's dreams for years to come. The woman approached him slowly, moving with the careful steps of someone crossing potentially dangerous ground, but her curiosity seemed to overcome her caution. When she was close enough to touch, she reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm, her fingers tracing the fabric of his shirt with wonder that suggested she had never encountered woven cloth before. Her touch was electric, not in any romantic sense, but in the profound recognition that passed between two human beings who existed in completely different worlds. David could feel the calluses on her fingers, evidence of a lifetime spent surviving in conditions that would have killed most people within days. But he could also sense her intelligence, her awareness that he represented something fundamentally different from the wolves that had shaped her understanding of existence. She spoke then, or tried to, producing sounds that were clearly attempts at human speech but filtered through vocal cords that had learned to communicate primarily through vocalizations. The words were incomprehensible, but the intent was unmistakably an attempt to bridge the gap between their worlds. David responded softly in Dakota, then in English, watching her react to the sounds of human language with fascination and growing excitement. The alpha male's patience with this unprecedented interaction was clearly reaching its limits. He began making warning sounds that caused the woman to look back at him with obvious conflict.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
David could see that she was torn between her curiosity about this strange human and her loyalty to the pack that had raised and protected her. The wolves were her family in every meaningful sense, and their concern for her safety was evident in their increasingly agitated behavior. David knew he had to make a choice that would respect both the woman's autonomy and the wolves' protective instincts. He slowly reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a piece of jerky, offering it to her with open palms in a gesture that he hoped would be understood as peaceful gift-giving. The woman examined the dried meat with interest, sniffing it carefully. Before taking a small bite, her expression showed surprise at the taste of prepared food, suggesting that her diet had consisted entirely of what the wolves could hunt or forage. The gift seemed to establish a tentative trust between them, but David understood that pushing further would likely trigger the pack's defensive instincts. Instead, he slowly stood and backed away from the spring, giving the wolves space to depart. If they chose. The woman watched him retreat with what appeared to be disappointment, but she made no move to follow when the alpha male led the pack away from the water source. As the wolves disappeared into the canyon shadows, the woman lingered for a moment longer, looking back at David with an expression that suggested their brief encounter had awakened something in her that had been dormant for years. Then she too vanished into the maze of red rock formations, leaving David alone by the spring with the impossible memory of a human being who lived as a wolf. David remained by the spring for over an hour, processing what he had witnessed and trying to understand its implications. The woman's existence raised questions that challenged everything he thought he knew about human nature and survival. How had she come to live with wolves? Where had she come from originally? Most importantly, what kind of life was she living in the wilderness, and was it possible for her to survive indefinitely in such conditions? His grandmother had told him stories about children who were raised by animals, but he had always assumed they were metaphorical tales meant to teach lessons about the connection between humans and nature. Seeing the reality of such an existence forced David to reconsider not just those stories, but his entire understanding of the boundary between civilization and wildness. The practical questions were equally troubling. Winter in the Badlands was brutal, with temperatures that could kill unprotected humans in hours. How did the woman survive the cold months? What did she eat when hunting was poor? How had she avoided the diseases and injuries that claimed the lives of even experienced frontiersmen? Her very existence was a testament to human adaptability that defied conventional wisdom about what people needed to survive. As David rode away from Devil's Gulch that afternoon, he found himself planning the return. The encounter had awakened something in him that he couldn't quite name, a sense of responsibility perhaps, or maybe just an overwhelming curiosity about a life so different from anything he had ever imagined. He had spent his entire adult life moving between this Dakota world of his mother's people and the white world of his father's heritage, but the woman by the spring existed in a third realm entirely. That night, camped under the stars near his cabin on the edge of what would soon become the town of Redemption Creek, David found himself unable to sleep. The image of the woman's intelligent blue eyes haunted him, along with the profound loneliness he had sensed beneath her wild exterior. She had achieved something remarkable by surviving in conditions that would have killed most people. But at what cost? What kind of human connection had she sacrificed for the protection and acceptance of the wolf pack? David's cabin was modest but comfortable, built on land that straddled the line between Dakota territory and the expanding settlements of white homesteaders. He had chosen the location carefully, wanting to remain connected to both worlds while belonging fully to neither. His work as a scout and guide allowed him to move freely between communities, but it also meant that he often felt like an outsider in both. The next morning brought visitors that would complicate David's plans to return to Devil's Gulch. Sarah McKenna arrived at his cabin just after dawn. accompanied by her younger brother Tommy and a stranger who introduced himself as Federal Marshal Robert Hayes. Sarah was the schoolteacher in Redemption Creek, a determined woman in her late 20s who had come west to escape a failed engagement in Boston and found her calling in educating the children of settlers and Dakota families alike. "David, we need your help," Sarah said without preamble, her usual composure cracked by obvious distress. 3 children from the settlement went missing 2 days ago. They were playing near Willow Creek when something spooked the horses and they scattered. "We found 2 of them, but little Mary Prescott is still out there somewhere, Marshal." Hayes stepped forward, his badge catching the morning sunlight. "The girl is 8 years old, Mr. Stormwind. She's been missing for over 48 hours in country that would challenge experienced trackers. We need someone who knows these lands better than anyone else. And everyone in 3 counties says, that's you." David felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Finding lost children was part of his calling as a scout, and Mary Prescott was the daughter of a widow who had already lost her husband to a mining accident. But accepting the tracking job would mean delaying his return to Devil's Gulch and the mysterious woman who had occupied his thoughts since their encounter. "I'll find her," David said simply, already gathering his tracking gear and preparing thunder for what could be a long search. "How long has it been since anyone saw her?" Tommy McKenna, barely 16 but already showing the determination that ran in his family, spoke up eagerly. "She was last seen near the old trading post ruins, maybe 5 miles upstream from the settlement. The other children said she was following what she thought was a friendly dog, but it might have been a wolf." The word wolf sent a chill through David that had nothing to do with the morning air. If Mary Prescott had encountered wolves in the wilderness, the chances of finding her alive were remote at best. Wolves generally avoided humans, but a lost child might trigger their hunting instincts, especially if she was injured or disoriented. As they rode toward the search area, David found himself thinking about the woman by the spring and wondering if there was any connection between her presence in Devil's Gulch and a missing child who had reportedly followed what might have been a wolf. The timing seemed too coincidental to ignore, but David kept his speculations to himself as they approached the area where Mary Prescott had last been seen. The trail that little Mary Prescott had left was heartbreakingly easy to follow for someone with David's tracking skills, but every sign pointed toward a conclusion that filled him with dread. Her small footprints showed she had indeed been following what appeared to be wolf tracks, moving deeper into the wilderness with the trusting innocence of a child who saw friendly dogs where adults would recognize dangerous predators. The tracks led steadily toward Devil's Gulch, the same canyon system where David had encountered the wolf-raised woman just 2 days earlier. Marshal Hayes rode beside David, his city-bred horse struggling with the rough terrain while his own inexperience with frontier tracking became increasingly obvious. "How can you be certain these are the girl's prints?" Hayes asked, squinting at marks in the dirt that were barely visible to his untrained eyes. "They could belong to any child, couldn't they?" David pointed to a clear impression in a patch of soft earth beside Willow Creek. "See the wear pattern on the right sole? Mary's mother mentioned she has a hole in that shoe from playing on the rocky ground behind their cabin. And look here," he indicated a small piece of torn fabric caught on a thorny bush. "This matches the blue dress her mother described." Sarah McKenna urged her horse closer to examine the evidence, her schoolteacher's analytical mind working to process the implications of what David was showing them. "The tracks are moving in a straight line toward the Badlands. No wandering or circling back like you'd expect from a lost child. It's as if she was following something specific." Tommy McKenna, eager to prove himself useful in the search, had been ranging ahead of the main group when he called back with news that made everyone's blood run cold. "David, you need to see this." His voice carried across the morning air with an urgency that spoke of discovery rather than mere speculation. Where Tommy waited, the story written in the earth became clear and terrifying. The child's tracks were joined by wolf prints, not just one or two animals, but what appeared to be an entire pack. But strangest of all were the human footprints that David recognized immediately. The same bare feet with spread toes that he had seen at the spring 2 days earlier. The wolf woman had been here, and from the way the tracks interacted, she had encountered Mary Prescott. Jesus and Mary, Marshall Hayes whispered, his face pale as he absorbed the implications of what they were seeing. The child was taken by wolves. There's no way she could survive that. We should be looking for a body, not a living girl. But David was reading a different story in the tracks, one that defied conventional wisdom about wolf behavior and human-animal interactions. The child's footprints showed no signs of running or struggling. There were no drag marks, no evidence of violence or panic. Instead, the tracks suggested that Mary had continued walking, now accompanied by the pack and the strange woman who moved among them. Look at this, David said, pointing to a section where the tracks were particularly clear. The wolves are moving in a protective formation around the child and the woman. See how the alpha male's prints are always between them and potential threats? This isn't predatory behavior. It's protective. Sarah knelt beside the tracks, her teacher's instincts for observation serving her well in this unexpected classroom. The spacing between the child's steps is normal, not the short, panicked strides you'd see from someone being forced to move against their will. And here, where they stop to rest, there's no evidence of restraints or confinement. What does this mean, David? David found himself in the impossible position of trying to explain something he barely understood himself. How could he tell these people that he had witnessed a human being living as part of a wolf pack without sounding like he'd lost his mind? Yet the evidence was undeniable, written clearly in the earth for anyone with the skills to read it. I think Mary encountered someone who lives with the wolves, David said carefully, choosing his words to convey information without revealing the full extent of what he had witnessed. Someone who might have taken her for reasons we don't understand yet. Our best chance of finding her is to follow these tracks and hope we can negotiate for her return. Marshall Hayes's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm. Negotiate? With someone who's obviously gone native and lost their human reason? Mr. Stormwind, if there's a renegade living with wolf packs and stealing children, our duty is clear. We stop them by whatever means necessary. The casual assumption of violence in Hayes's response crystallized something in David's mind about the fundamental difference between those who understood the frontier and those who tried to impose Eastern solutions on Western problems. The Marshal saw only a threat to be eliminated, while David recognized a mystery that required careful investigation and possibly delicate diplomacy. If you start shooting, Marshal, you'll guarantee that child's death, David said with quiet authority. Wolves respond to aggression with aggression, and if there's someone living with them who has kept Mary alive this long, antagonizing them isn't going to improve her chances of survival. We do this my way, or you can explain to her, Mother, why your impatience got her daughter killed. The rebuke stung Hayes visibly, but the logic was unassailable. They continued following the tracks deeper into the Badlands, the terrain becoming increasingly difficult as they approached the maze of canyons and rock formations that characterized Devil's Gulch. David found himself torn between hope and fear, hoping that his instincts about the wolf woman's protective nature were correct while fearing what they might find if he was wrong. The trail led them to a narrow canyon that David recognized as one of the hidden passages that honeycombed the Badlands, invisible from a distance, but providing concealed routes for those who knew their secrets. The tracks disappeared onto solid rock, but David's knowledge of the area allowed him to predict where they would emerge. If he was right, they were heading toward a series of natural caves that would provide shelter and water. We leave the horses here, David announced as they reached a point where the canyon became too narrow for mounted travel. From here on we go on foot, and we go quietly. If Mary is alive, it's because whoever has her doesn't see us as a threat yet. Let's keep it that way. The canyon walls rose on either side of them like the ribs of some massive prehistoric creature, red sandstone sculpted by millennia of wind and water, into fantastic shapes that seemed almost deliberately designed to conceal and confuse. David moved with the silent confidence of someone who had learned these passages as a child, but his companions struggled with the unfamiliar terrain and the growing sense of entering a world governed by different rules. The sound reached them. First, echoing off the canyon walls with an eerie quality that made it difficult to determine direction or distance. It was singing, a human voice raised in a melody that seemed part lullaby and part wolf song, hauntingly beautiful and utterly unlike anything any of them had heard before. The voice was unmistakably female, and it carried through the canyon air with the clarity of someone completely comfortable in their environment. David motioned for silence and led them toward the source of the singing, moving with exaggerated care to avoid disturbing loose rocks that might alert their quarry to their approach. As they rounded a bend in the canyon, the sight that greeted them defied every assumption they had made about what they would find. In a natural amphitheater carved from red stone, beside a spring that bubbled up from underground sources, the Wolf woman sat with little Mary Prescott cradled in her arms. The child was alive, unharmed, and apparently completely comfortable with her unusual captor. The Wolf pack lounged around them in relaxed poses that spoke of security and contentment, rather than the alertness of predators guarding prey. Mary was clean, her torn dress had been mended with plant fibers, and she was eating what appeared to be wild berries from the woman's cupped hands. The Wolf woman's singing was clearly intended as a lullaby, and Mary was responding with the drowsy contentment of a child being cared for by someone she trusted. The scene was so peaceful, so natural, that it took David's companion several moments to process what they were actually seeing. "My God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible even to those standing beside her. "She's caring for the child like a mother. Look at how gentle she's being, how comfortable Mary seems. This isn't abduction, it's rescue." But Marshal Hayes was already reaching for his weapon, his law enforcement instincts interpreting the scene through a lens of suspicion and assumed criminality. "That's a wild woman holding a civilized child," he hissed. "Whatever her intentions, she has no right to take that girl from her family." David's hand closed over the marshal's wrist with iron strength, preventing him from drawing his gun. "You draw that weapon, and you'll start a war we can't win," he said in a voice that carried absolute conviction. "6 wolves and someone who knows these canyons better than we do. We'd all be dead before you could fire a second shot." The confrontation between David and Hayes might have escalated into violence, but it was interrupted by a sound that chilled all of them to the bone. The Wolf woman had stopped singing and was looking directly at their hiding place with those pale blue eyes that David remembered so vividly. She had known they were there, possibly from the moment they entered the canyon, and had been waiting to see what they would do. She spoke to Mary in a mixture of sounds that seemed part human language and part wolf communication, and the child responded by nestling closer to her protector. Then the woman stood, lifting Mary with an ease that spoke of considerable physical strength, and began moving toward their position with the confident gait of someone approaching a planned meeting. Rather than a chance encounter, "She's coming toward us," Tommy McKenna observed unnecessarily, his voice tight with nervous excitement. "What do we do now?" David made a decision that would determine whether this encounter ended in bloodshed or understanding. He stepped out from their concealment with his hands clearly visible and empty, moving slowly and deliberately as he had during his first meeting with the Wolf woman. "Everyone stay calm and follow my lead," he said quietly. "No sudden movements, no threatening gestures. Let me handle this." The Wolf woman approached to within 10 feet of their group before stopping, studying each of them with the careful assessment David remembered from their first encounter. Mary seemed completely unafraid, even curious about these new people who had appeared in her temporary sanctuary. The wolves had risen to their feet but showed no signs of aggression, apparently trusting their pack members' judgment about the level of threat these humans represented. When the woman spoke, her voice carried the same attempts at human speech that David had heard before, but now there were actual words mixed with the growls and vocalizations. "Man from Spring," she said, pointing at David with obvious recognition. "You came back. Brought others." Why, the fact that she could speak recognizable English, even in broken fragments, stunned everyone except David. This wasn't a completely feral human who had lost all connection to civilized communication. This was someone who retained enough humanity to learn and adapt, someone who could potentially be reasoned with. "We came looking for the child," David said carefully, his voice gentle but clear. "Her mother is worried. Her people are searching. We want to make sure she's safe." The woman looked down at Mary, then back at David, her expression showing the conflict between understanding and something that might have been possessiveness. "Child was lost, crying, alone. Wolves found her. I found her. Protected her, fed her. Safe now." Sarah stepped forward slowly, her teacher's instincts recognizing an opportunity for communication that might bridge the gap between wildness and civilization. "You did protect her," she said warmly. "You saved her life. Her mother will be grateful. But she needs to go home to her family. Can you understand that?" The word family seemed to strike a chord with the wolf woman that went deeper than David had expected. Her expression changed, becoming distant and pained, as if the concept had awakened memories that she normally kept buried. When she spoke again, her voice carried an ache that transcended language barriers. "Had family. Once," she said haltingly. "Long ago before wolves. Family gone. Wolves became family. This child has family still? People who love her." Mary, who had been listening to this exchange with the adaptability of childhood, suddenly spoke up in her clear 8-year-old voice. "My mama loves me very much. She's probably crying because she thinks I'm lost. Luna has been taking good care of me, but I want to go home to mama." The name Luna seemed to surprise everyone, including the wolf woman herself. It was the first time any of them had heard her called by a human name, and David wondered if Mary had given it to her, or if it was something she remembered from her forgotten past. "Luna," the woman repeated, as if testing the sound of having a name again. "Luna, yes, I am Luna. Child is Mary," she told me. "Smart child, brave child, survived alone in wilderness. But wolves not her family. Should go to real family." The decision to release Mary came more easily than David had dared hope, but it was clear that Luna was struggling with more than just returning a lost child. She was confronting the fundamental question of what constituted family, what bonds were genuine, and what sacrifices were justified in the name of love and protection. As Luna gently transferred Mary to Sarah's arms, the little girl surprised everyone by turning back to her unusual rescuer. "Will I see you again, Luna? You could come visit us in town. Mama makes really good apple pie." The innocence of the invitation, the casual assumption that someone who lived with wolves might simply visit for dessert, crystallized the extraordinary nature of what they had all witnessed. Mary had spent 2 days with a pack of wolves and a woman who existed outside all conventional definitions of civilization, and she saw nothing impossible about maintaining that friendship within the normal structures of frontier society. Luna's response to Mary's invitation revealed depths of longing and loss that made David's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Town's not for Luna," she said sadly. "People not understand. Wolves not welcome. Luna belongs in wild places. But Luna will remember Mary, will watch from distance. Keep her safe always." As they prepared to leave the canyon with Mary safely returned to their care, David found himself reluctant to simply walk away from Luna and return to normal life, as if this encounter had never happened. The woman who had chosen to live with wolves rather than face whatever trauma had driven her from human society deserved more than abandonment to her isolation. "Luna," he called back as she began to retreat toward her wolf family. The offer Mary made about visiting town. "It doesn't have to be impossible. There are people who would understand, who wouldn't judge. You don't have to be alone forever." Her response carried across the canyon air like a promise and a challenge. "Maybe someday, man from spring. When winter comes hard and wolves need warm place. When Luna remembers enough words to speak with town people. Maybe then Luna comes to see if apple pie worth leaving mountains." As they made their way back through the canyon system toward their horses and the return journey to Redemption Creek, David found himself planning a return visit to Devil's Gulch that would be motivated by more than simple curiosity. Luna had saved Mary's life and demonstrated a capacity for human connection that suggested her exile from civilization might not be permanent. But bringing her back to human society would require more than good intentions and apple pie. 3 months had passed since Mary Prescott's rescue, and the story of the wolf woman had spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire, growing more fantastic with each telling until Luna had become a legend that bore little resemblance to the reality David had witnessed. Some claimed she was a vengeful spirit, punishing settlers for trespassing on sacred land. Others insisted she was a witch who commanded supernatural powers over wild beasts, and a few persistent rumors suggested she was actually the lost daughter of a wealthy Eastern family who had gone mad from grief. David had kept his own counsel about the truth of Luna's nature, sharing details only with those who had witnessed her caring treatment of Mary. But even among that small group, opinions varied wildly about what should be done. Marshal Hayes had filed an official report describing an unnamed white woman living in primitive conditions who posed a potential threat to settlement security, while Sarah McKenna had begun researching historical records of missing persons who might match Luna's approximate age and appearance. The approaching winter had become David's primary concern, not for his own comfort, but for Luna's survival in conditions that would test even her remarkable adaptability. The Badlands were brutal during the cold months, with temperatures that could drop 40 degrees below zero and blizzards that could last for days without break. Even the wolves that had adopted Luna would struggle to find adequate food and shelter during the harshest months. It was Tommy McKenna who brought news that would force David to confront the reality of Luna's situation sooner than he had planned. The young man arrived at David's cabin on a gray October morning when the first frost had already begun painting the prairie grass silver, his horse lathered from hard riding and his face grim with urgent purpose. "David, you need to come with me right now," Tommy said without preamble, swinging down from his saddle with the easy grace of someone raised on horseback. "There's been trouble in town, and it involves your wolf woman. Some of the miners from the silver claims have been telling stories about seeing her watching the settlement from the hills, and now they're talking about organizing a hunting party." The news hit David like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about how the townspeople might react to Luna's proximity to their community. The silver miners were rough men who had come west seeking quick wealth, and had little patience for anything that might threaten their operations or their safety. If they had decided Luna represented a danger, they wouldn't hesitate to shoot first and investigate later. "What exactly are they claiming she's done?" David asked, already reaching for his rifle and the heavy coat that would be necessary for extended time in the wilderness. "Has anyone actually been threatened or harmed?" Tommy shook his head, but his expression remained troubled. "Nothing concrete, but you know how these things work. One man claims he saw her stealing food from his camp. Another says his mules were spooked by wolf howls that sounded too human. And pretty soon they've convinced themselves she's planning some kind of coordinated attack. Buck Morrison is organizing them, and you know what kind of man he is." David did indeed know Buck Morrison, a brutal opportunist who had been run out of 2 previous mining camps for violence. against both fellow miners and local Native Americans. Morrison saw threats everywhere and responded to them with a level of viciousness that had earned him a reputation, even among men who weren't known for their gentle natures. If he was organizing a hunting party to go after Luna, her survival would depend on finding her before they did. The ride to Redemption Creek revealed a community in the grip of an irrational fear that had been fed by too many saloon stories and too little actual information. Groups of men clustered outside the Mercantile and the Silver Dollar Saloon, their conversations animated by the kind of excitement that accompanied mob formation. David could see weapons being cleaned and supplies being gathered for what was clearly intended to be more than a simple patrol. Sarah McKenna met them at the schoolhouse, her usual composed demeanor cracked by obvious distress at the turn events had taken. "I've tried reasoning with them," she said without preamble, "but they're not interested in facts or evidence. Buck Morrison has convinced them that Luna represents some kind of existential threat to the settlement, and they're planning to leave at first light tomorrow to hunt her down like a dangerous animal." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on David. Luna, who had demonstrated more humanity and compassion in caring for a lost child than most of these men showed toward their fellow humans, was being hunted by people who claimed to represent civilization. The real danger wasn't from a woman who lived with wolves, but from men who had abandoned their own humanity in pursuit of profit and dominance. "Where's Marshal Hayes in all this?" David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Isn't maintaining law and order supposed to be his responsibility?" Tommy's snort of disgust confirmed David's suspicions. "Hayes is conveniently away on official business in the territorial capital. Left town 3 days ago, right about the time the mining crews started getting worked up about Luna. Some folks think he doesn't want to be around when things get ugly." The absence of federal law enforcement meant that whatever happened to Luna would be determined by frontier justice, which in this case meant the will of whoever could organize the most guns. David understood that he was facing a situation where legal authority had abdicated its responsibility, leaving moral authority as the only check on mob violence. As they discussed their limited options for preventing the hunting party from finding Luna, an unexpected voice joined their conversation. Mary Prescott, now fully recovered from her adventure, and apparently none the worse for her time in the wilderness, had approached their group with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Are you talking about Luna?" Mary asked innocently. "She's been watching over me, you know. I've seen her on the hill behind our house sometimes, especially when Mama has to work late at the laundry. Luna makes sure I'm safe." The revelation that Luna had been quietly protecting Mary from a distance added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Rather than retreating deep into the wilderness after returning the child, Luna had apparently remained close enough to continue her self-appointed role as guardian. The behavior suggested a level of attachment and responsibility that contradicted every assumption the hunting party was making about her intentions. Sarah knelt down to Mary's eye level, her teacher's instincts recognizing an opportunity to gather crucial information. "Mary, when you see Luna, does she seem dangerous or frightening? Has she ever done anything that made you feel unsafe?" The 8-year-old's response was immediate and emphatic. "Luna would never hurt anybody. She's the one who taught me which berries were safe to eat and how to find clean water when I was lost. She even sang me to sleep when I was scared." The men who want to hunt her are the ones who are scary. David felt a surge of anger at the thought of armed men pursuing someone whose only crimes were living differently and caring for others. But anger wouldn't solve the immediate problem of keeping Luna alive through the winter, and it certainly wouldn't protect her from Morrison's hunting party. What was needed was a plan that addressed both the immediate threat and the longer-term challenge of ensuring her survival. The solution came from an unexpected source: Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the town's physician, and one of the few people in Redemption Creek with formal education beyond the elementary level. had been listening to their conversation from the doorway of her clinic. When she finally spoke, her words carried the authority of someone who had spent years dealing with life and death decisions. "There's a legal precedent that might help," Dr. Hartwell said, approaching their group with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being heard. "In territorial law, any person found living in conditions that threaten their health and safety can be taken into protective custody for their own welfare. If Luna is indeed living in primitive conditions that would endanger her during winter, we could justify bringing her into town for her protection rather than her persecution." The legal framework Dr. Hartwell proposed offered a way to remove Luna from immediate danger while providing time to develop a longer-term solution to her situation. But executing such a plan would require finding Luna before Morrison's hunting party did, convincing her to trust people she had been avoiding, and somehow integrating someone who had lived as a wolf into a community that currently viewed her as a threat. David made a decision that would commit him to a course of action with unpredictable consequences. "I'll go find her and explain the situation. If she's been watching this settlement, she probably already knows about the hunting party. She might be willing to accept protection if she understands the alternative." The plan they developed over the next hour was necessarily rushed but addressed the most critical elements of Luna's immediate survival. David would locate her in the Badlands and explain the situation, offering her sanctuary in town until the hunting party abandoned their pursuit. Dr. Hartwell would prepare medical documentation supporting the protective custody justification, while Sarah would work to counter the rumors and misinformation that had fueled the mob mentality. As David prepared to depart for Devil's Gulch, Mary Prescott approached him with something clutched in her small hands. "Will you give this to Luna?" she asked, holding out a carefully wrapped bundle. "It's some of Mama's apple pie and a warm scarf I made for her. Tell her I hope she'll come visit us soon." The simple gift from a child to her unlikely protector crystallized everything that was at stake in the approaching confrontation. Luna represented something precious that was being threatened by fear and ignorance, something that could enrich the community if given a chance, but would be lost forever if destroyed by prejudice and violence. David's journey to Devil's Gulch took him through terrain that was already showing signs of the approaching winter. The cottonwood trees had turned golden, their leaves falling in drifts that rustled beneath thunder's hooves. The air carried the sharp bite of frost, and ice was forming along the edges of the smaller streams. In another month, these passages would be difficult to navigate, and in 2 months, they would be impassable except for the most experienced wilderness travelers. The silence in the canyons was different from what David remembered from previous visits, deeper and more complete, as if the approaching winter had driven most wildlife to seek shelter in warmer places. But the absence of normal sounds made Luna's presence obvious long before he saw her. The wolf pack was alert and nervous, their behavior suggesting they were aware of the hunting party's preparations and the increased human activity in their territory. David found Luna at the spring where they had first met, but her circumstances had changed dramatically since their last encounter. The woman who had appeared wild but healthy 3 months earlier was now showing clear signs of the stress that came from constant vigilance and inadequate nutrition. Her clothes, such as they were, had deteriorated further, and her lean frame suggested that food had become increasingly scarce as the wolves struggled to hunt successfully in the face of human encroachment. When she saw David approaching, Luna's initial reaction was wariness rather than the curious interest she had shown during their previous meetings. The wolf pack positioned themselves defensively around her, and David could see that recent events had reinforced their natural distrust of humans. Whatever peaceful coexistence Luna might have been developing with the settlement had been shattered by the obvious threat represented by Morrison's organizing efforts. "Dangerous time," Luna said without preamble when David came within speaking distance. "Men with guns looking for Luna. Wolves smell anger, fear. Bad combination." Luna must take pact deeper into mountains before snow comes. David dismounted and approached slowly, carrying Mary's carefully wrapped gift as both a peace offering and a reminder of the positive connections Luna had formed with the settlement. "The little girl you saved wants you to have this," he said, holding out the bundle. "She's been worried about you." Luna accepted the gift with obvious emotion, unwrapping it carefully to reveal the apple pie and handmade scarf. She held the scarf against her face, inhaling the scent of human habitation and civilization, and for a moment her expression showed a longing that transcended the boundaries between her world and his. "Mary, safe?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. "Hunting men not threaten child. Mary is safe," David assured her. "But you're not. The men organizing against you won't be satisfied with driving you away. They see you as a problem that needs to be eliminated permanently. If you stay out here, they will find you eventually, and when they do, you won't survive the encounter." The conversation that followed would determine whether Luna lived to see another spring or became another victim of the frontier's casual violence against anyone who didn't conform to narrow definitions of acceptable humanity. David explained the protective custody option, the legal framework that would allow her to winter in town while maintaining her freedom to return to the wilderness when the threat passed. Luna's response revealed depths of intelligence and understanding that David had only glimpsed in their previous encounters. Town people fear Luna because Luna different. Living with them not solve fear, maybe make worse. Luna in cage, even comfortable cage, still prisoner. The objection was valid and showed that Luna understood the social dynamics involved better than David had given her credit for. Simply bringing her to town wouldn't address the underlying prejudices that had created the current crisis, and it might actually make things worse by forcing confrontation between incompatible worldviews. But as they talked, the sound of distant gunshots echoed through the canyon system, a reminder that Morrison's hunting party was already beginning their search. Time was running out for subtle solutions, and survival was becoming a more immediate concern than social integration. The gunshots that echoed through Devil's Gulch weren't random hunting fire, but the deliberate pattern of men signaling their positions to coordinate a systematic search. Buck Morrison had organized his hunting party with military precision, dividing the canyon system into sectors and posting sentries at key exit points to prevent Luna's escape. David realized with growing dread that this wasn't just a mob seeking to drive away an unwanted presence, but a coordinated extermination effort designed to end Luna's life permanently. Luna's reaction to the approaching threat revealed survival instincts honed by years of living as prey in a landscape filled with predators. She immediately began gathering the few possessions she valued, wrapping them in the scarf Mary had given her while issuing complex vocalizations to her wolf pack. The animals responded with an efficiency that spoke of previous escapes from human persecution, each wolf taking a position that would facilitate rapid movement through terrain their pursuers couldn't follow. "How many men?" Luna asked David, her voice carrying the calm focus of someone calculating odds and planning strategy rather than panicking in the face of danger. How well they know canyon paths. Luna and wolves know every cave, every hidden water, every passage too narrow for horses. David quickly assessed what he knew about Morrison's hunting party from Tommy's description and his own observations of the men gathering in town. 12 men, maybe 15. Most of them are miners who don't know the Badlands well, but Morrison has hired Jake Winters as a guide, and Winters knows these canyons almost as well as you do. The mention of Jake Winters as Morrison's guide added a complication that changed the entire nature of the threat Luna faced. Winters was a former Army scout who had turned to guiding hunting parties and survey expeditions after being discharged for excessive brutality during the Indian Wars. Unlike the other members of Morrison's group, Winters understood wilderness tracking and had the patience to pursue quarry for days or weeks if necessary. Luna's expression grew thoughtful as she processed this information, her intelligence clearly superior to what most people assumed about someone living in primitive conditions. Winter's dangerous because he thinks like predator, not like prey. Other men make noise, leave obvious trail, give up when hunting becomes difficult. Winters will follow Luna until one of us dies. The tactical assessment was accurate and chilling in its implications. While Luna could easily evade the miners who comprised most of Morrison's group, Winters represented a level of professional threat that would require different strategies. The approaching winter, which had already been a concern for Luna's long-term survival, now became an immediate factor in a deadly game of cat and mouse. As they spoke, the sound of horses and voices grew closer, indicating that at least part of the hunting party was approaching their current location. David realized that his presence at the spring had probably been observed, giving Morrison's group a starting point for their search that eliminated Luna's advantage of concealment. His attempt to warn her had inadvertently led her enemies directly to her sanctuary. "Luna must leave now," she said with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone accustomed to abandoning everything at a moment's notice. Wolves know winter caves in high country can survive until snow melts if careful. But Luna cannot take David's protection offer now. Too dangerous for town people if hunting men think they helping Luna. The logic was sound but heartbreaking. Luna was choosing exile over the possibility of safety because she understood that accepting help would endanger the very people trying to protect her. It was a level of selflessness that David hadn't expected from someone he had initially viewed as more animal than human. But before Luna could begin her retreat deeper into the wilderness, a new sound reached them that changed everything. It was the howling of wolves, but not Luna's pack. This was the distress call of animals in pain and terror, coming from the direction of the canyon where Luna's pack normally sheltered during the day. Morrison's hunting party hadn't just come to capture or kill Luna, they were systematically destroying everything connected to her existence. Luna's reaction to the sounds was immediate and visceral. The composed survival strategist disappeared, replaced by a figure of pure rage whose connection to her wolf family transcended any consideration of personal safety. She was moving before David could react, racing toward the source of the howling. With a speed and agility that reminded him forcibly of her animal upbringing, David followed as quickly as the terrain would allow. But Luna's knowledge of hidden paths and her desperate urgency gave her a significant lead. By the time he reached the canyon where the pack normally rested, the scene that greeted him was one of deliberate cruelty that defied every principle of civilized behavior. 3 of Luna's wolves lay dead or dying, shot not cleanly by hunters, but wounded and left to suffer by men who were using torture as a tool to draw their real quarry into the open. Jake Winters stood over the largest wolf, a magnificent gray male who was clearly the pack's alpha, reloading his rifle with the methodical patience of someone prepared to inflict maximum suffering. Luna emerged from concealment like a force of nature, moving with a combination of human intelligence and animal ferocity that caught the hunters completely off guard. She struck Winters with a piece of sharp flint before he could bring his rifle to bear, opening a gash across his face that would leave permanent scars. But her attack, while devastating in its initial impact, had revealed her position to the other members of the hunting party. The gunfight that followed was unlike anything David had witnessed in his years on the frontier. Luna fought with the tactical advantages of someone who knew every rock and crevice in the canyon, appearing and disappearing like a ghost while using weapons fashioned from stone and salvaged metal. But she was one person facing 12 armed men, and despite her supernatural knowledge of the terrain, the odds were impossible. David found himself faced with a choice that would define his character and his conscience for the rest of his life. He could retreat to safety and report the massacre to whatever authorities might eventually investigate, or he could intervene in a fight that would likely cost him his life, but might give Luna a chance to escape. The decision came from a part of him that transcended rational calculation, His Winchester rifle spoke with the authority of someone who had learned marksmanship from Dakota warriors and perfected it through years of hunting dangerous game. 2 of Morrison's men went down before they realized they were under attack from an unexpected direction, and David's strategic position on the canyon rim gave him a temporary advantage that allowed Luna to reposition herself among rocks that provided better cover. Buck Morrison's response to David's intervention revealed the true nature of his character and his intentions. Stormwind. He bellowed from behind a boulder that shielded him from David's rifle. "You're harboring a dangerous savage who attacks civilized people. Stand down and we'll let you ride away from this. Keep fighting and you'll die with her." The offer of clemency was clearly a tactical maneuver designed to isolate Luna by removing her only ally. But David's response came from convictions that had been building since his first encounter with the woman who lived with wolves. "The only savages I see are the ones torturing animals and hunting a woman whose only crime is living differently," he shouted back, punctuating his words with rifle fire that kept Morrison's group pinned down. The siege that developed over the next hour tested both David's ammunition reserves and Luna's ability to move unseen through terrain that offered decreasing cover as the hunters adjusted their positions. Jake Winters, despite the wound Luna had inflicted, was systematically closing off escape routes with the professional competence that made him dangerous to experienced prey. It was Luna who provided the tactical breakthrough that would determine the outcome of their desperate fight. Using her knowledge of the canyon's hidden passages, she had worked her way behind the hunters' positions and was now in a position to attack them from an unexpected direction. But instead of launching another assault, she used her position to deliver an ultimatum that revealed the full extent of her understanding of human nature. "Winters," Luna called from her concealment behind the hunting party. "Luna knows these canyons better than you know your own camp. Can pick off your men one at a time, or can make you all disappear in passages where bodies never found. But Luna offers different choice. Take wounded men and leave. Never come back. Forget Luna exists." The negotiation that followed was conducted through shouted exchanges between people who couldn't see each other but were intimately aware of their relative positions and capabilities. Winters, despite his experience and professional pride, was beginning to understand that he had underestimated both Luna's tactical intelligence and her knowledge of terrain that offered endless opportunities for ambush. But it was Buck Morrison who ultimately determined how the confrontation would be resolved. Driven by a combination of greed, pride, and the kind of racial hatred that had motivated his previous violence against Native Americans, Morrison rejected any possibility of retreat or negotiation. "We came here to solve a problem," he shouted to his men, "and we're not leaving until that problem is dead and buried." Morrison's refusal to accept Luna's offer of safe passage triggered a renewed assault that would test everyone's commitment to their chosen positions. But the dynamics of the fight had changed during the negotiation period, with Luna and David now coordinating their defensive efforts while the hunting party's initial advantage of numbers was being offset by casualties and the demoralization that came from facing more effective resistance than expected. The turning point came when Luna demonstrated capabilities that none of the hunters had anticipated. Using skills learned from years of hunting with wolves, she had been systematically undermining the hunters' positions by loosening rocks above their defensive positions. When she finally triggered the avalanche she had been preparing, the result was devastating. The rockslide didn't kill Morrison's men, but it separated them from their horses and most of their supplies, while blocking the easiest exit from the canyon. Suddenly the hunters found themselves in the position of being hunted, trapped in terrain controlled by an opponent who understood its dangers better than they understood their own weapons. Jake Winters, reading the tactical situation with professional clarity, made the decision that Morrison's pride prevented him from making. "This is over," he announced to his remaining men. "We're leaving now while we still can." Anyone who wants to stay and die for Morrison's ego is welcome to do it alone. The mutiny within the hunting party developed quickly as the surviving miners realized that their guide's assessment was accurate. They had come expecting to hunt down a helpless savage and instead found themselves outmaneuvered by someone whose intelligence and tactical skills exceeded their own. The promise of easy violence had been replaced by the reality of dangerous combat against a superior opponent. As most of the hunting party began retreating toward their horses, Buck Morrison made a final desperate attempt to salvage his mission. Abandoning cover, he charged toward Luna's position with his rifle blazing, determined to kill her even if it cost him his own life. His assault was brave in its way, but also futile against someone who had been preparing for exactly this kind of desperate attack. Luna's response to Morrison's charge demonstrated the full extent of her transformation from the frightened woman David had first encountered to someone who had integrated the best qualities of both her human intelligence and her wolf-learned survival skills. She didn't meet Morrison's attack directly, but instead used his momentum against him in a way that sent him tumbling into one of the canyon's deeper crevices. The sound of Morrison's impact echoed through the canyon like a final punctuation mark on the violence that had threatened to destroy everything Luna had built in her years of wilderness exile. When the echoes faded, the silence that remained was different from the peace David remembered from previous visits to Devil's Gulch. It was the quiet that came after a storm, carrying the promise of new beginnings, but also the scars of what had been lost. David climbed down from his position on the canyon rim to find Luna kneeling beside the body of the alpha wolf who had been like a father to her for most of her adult life. The magnificent animal was beyond saving, but Luna was speaking to him in the complex mixture of human words and wolf vocalizations that had become her natural language. "Was good father," Luna said when David approached, her voice carrying a grief that transcended species boundaries. "Taught Luna to hunt, to survive, to protect pack. Now pack broken, scattered. Luna alone again." The loss of her wolf family forced Luna to confront the fundamental question that had shaped her existence since childhood. What constituted family, and where did she truly belong? The pack that had raised and protected her was destroyed. The human community that might accept her was still dangerous, and winter was approaching with the promise of challenges that would test her survival skills to their limits. As they stood together in the aftermath of violence that had solved nothing and cost everything, David realized that Luna's choice about accepting protection in Redemption Creek was no longer just about her safety. It was about whether she could find a way to build a new kind of family, one that honored both her wolf-learned values and her human potential. "The offer still stands," David said quietly, watching Luna process grief and loss with a stoicism that spoke of too much experience with both. "Winter's coming hard this year, and you've lost the pack that helped you survive previous winters. The town isn't perfect, but there are people there who would welcome you." Luna's response would determine whether David's intervention in the hunt had saved her life or merely postponed her death by a few months. But as she looked around the canyon that had been her sanctuary and her prison for most of her adult life, something in her expression suggested that she was finally ready to consider possibilities that had once seemed impossible. "Luna, tired of running," she said finally, her voice carrying a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Tired of being alone. Maybe time to learn if wolves and people can share same territory without killing each other. Maybe time to see if apple pie really worth leaving mountains." The decision to accompany David back to Redemption Creek represented more than just accepting shelter for the winter. It was Luna's choice to attempt the most dangerous transformation she had ever undertaken, the journey from wolf woman to someone who could exist in both worlds without losing the essential parts of herself that had made survival possible. Luna's first night in Redemption Creek was spent not in the comfortable boarding house room that Sarah McKenna had prepared for her, but crouched in the corner of Dr. Hartwell's clinic, wrapped in blankets but unable to sleep under a roof that felt more like a trap than shelter. The walls that were meant to provide protection instead created a suffocating sense of confinement for someone who had spent 18 years with nothing but sky above her head and endless horizons stretching in every direction. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell watched her unusual patient through the long hours of darkness, fascinated from a medical perspective by Luna's obvious physical adaptations to wilderness living, but troubled by the psychological trauma that was clearly manifesting as Luna struggled to adapt to enclosed spaces. The woman's breathing became labored whenever she couldn't see multiple escape routes, and she startled at every sound that penetrated the clinic's walls. The claustrophobia is understandable, Dr. Hartwell explained to David when he arrived at dawn to check on Luna's condition. Her nervous system has been conditioned to interpret enclosed spaces as potential death traps. What's remarkable is how quickly she's trying to adapt. Most people with her level of wilderness conditioning would be completely unable to function indoors. Luna herself was struggling with adaptations that went far beyond simple discomfort with buildings and walls. The constant noise of a human settlement, even one as small as Redemption Creek, was overwhelming to senses that had been attuned to the subtle sounds of the natural world. Every conversation, every footstep, every creak of wooden buildings created a cacophony that made it impossible for her to distinguish between normal activity and potential threats. Sarah McKenna arrived at the clinic, carrying a carefully prepared breakfast and a set of women's clothing that she hoped might begin Luna's transition toward a more conventional appearance. But the reaction she received challenged every assumption she had made about how to help someone integrate into civilized society. Luna examined the dress with obvious confusion, holding the fabric up to the light and testing its texture with fingers that had known only animal hides and rough woven materials scavenged from abandoned camps. "Why covering has so many layers?" she asked, her improving English still colored by the directness of someone who had learned communication from wolves. "How does person move quickly in emergency if wrapped in all this cloth?" The question revealed a fundamental difference in worldview that would complicate every aspect of Luna's integration into town life. Where Sarah saw appropriate clothing that would help Luna blend in with other women, Luna saw restricting garments that would handicap her ability to survive dangerous situations. The disconnect between their perspectives highlighted the challenge of bridging the gap between civilization and wilderness survival. But it was the arrival of Mary Prescott that provided the first real breakthrough in Luna's adaptation to her new environment. The 8-year-old burst into the clinic with the enthusiasm of childhood, carrying a basket of fresh-baked cookies and completely unintimidated by Luna's wild appearance or obvious discomfort with indoor spaces. "Luna, you came to visit just like you promised," Mary exclaimed, settling herself on the floor beside Luna with the casual ease of someone who saw nothing unusual about befriending a woman raised by wolves. "Mama sent cookies, and I brought my favorite book so I can read you stories." "Do you know about stories?" Luna's reaction to Mary's presence was immediate and profound. The tension that had kept her coiled like a spring since entering the clinic began to ease, and for the first time since arriving in town, she allowed herself to relax enough to actually examine her surroundings with curiosity rather than purely defensive assessment. "Luna knows stories," she said, settling into a more comfortable position as Mary opened her book. "Wolves tell stories with howls and movements, stories about hunting and danger and safe places to rest." But Luna curious about people's stories with words and pictures. The reading session that followed provided everyone present with insights into Luna's intelligence and learning capacity that challenged their assumptions about what someone raised in the wilderness might be capable of achieving. Luna absorbed the written words with remarkable speed, connecting letters to sounds with an intuitive understanding that suggested formal education might be possible despite her unconventional background. Dr. Hartwell observed the interaction. Between Luna and Mary, with the clinical interest of someone documenting an unprecedented case study. "Her cognitive abilities are clearly superior," she murmured to David. "The language acquisition rate alone suggests that her years in the wilderness enhanced rather than diminished her intellectual development. She's not a damaged person who needs to be fixed, but someone with unique capabilities that need to be understood and appreciated." As the morning progressed, other townspeople began arriving at the clinic, drawn by curiosity about the legendary Wolf woman who had finally emerged from the Badlands. But their reactions varied dramatically, revealing the deep divisions within. The community about how Luna should be received and what her presence meant for their settlement. Tommy McKenna brought news from the sheriff's office that Jake Winters had filed an official report about the deaths in Devil's Gulch, but had attributed them to an unfortunate hunting accident rather than admitting his role in Morrison's illegal persecution campaign. The surviving members of the hunting party had apparently agreed to maintain silence about what had actually happened, recognizing that the truth would expose them to legal consequences they preferred to avoid. Winters is telling people that Morrison fell into a crevice while tracking a wounded deer, Tommy reported quietly. He's not mentioning Luna or the Wolf Pack or any of the real reasons they were out there. Seems like everyone wants to pretend the whole thing never happened. The official whitewashing of recent events provided Luna with a measure of protection from legal repercussions, but it also meant that the community hadn't confronted the prejudices and fears that had motivated Morrison's violence in the first place. The underlying tensions that had created the hunting party remained unresolved, and Luna's presence in town was likely to reactivate them unless addressed directly. It was Reverend Joshua Matthews who provided the first real test of whether Redemption Creek could accept Luna as a member of their community rather than merely tolerating her as a temporary curiosity. The minister arrived at the clinic with the stated intention of offering spiritual guidance to someone he viewed as a lost soul in need of salvation. "Miss Luna," Reverend Matthews began with the practiced tone of someone accustomed to addressing moral waywardness. "I understand you've been living outside the bonds of Christian society for many years. I've come to discuss your spiritual condition and offer guidance toward proper moral behavior." Luna's response to the minister's assumptions revealed both her intelligence and her complete lack of patience for condescension disguised as concern. Luna lived with creatures who never lie, never steal, never hurt others for pleasure or profit, she said with quiet dignity. Perhaps Reverend should explain why people who claim to follow loving God need lessons in moral behavior from wolves. The theological discussion that followed challenged Reverend Matthews' comfortable assumptions about civilization, morality, and the relationship between human society and divine approval. Luna's questions about Christian behavior versus the realities she had observed in her brief exposure to town life were pointed and difficult to answer without acknowledging uncomfortable truths about human nature. But the conversation also revealed Luna's genuine curiosity about spiritual matters and her sophisticated understanding of moral philosophy developed through years of living according to natural laws rather than human conventions. Her insights into community behavior, loyalty, and mutual protection often demonstrated wisdom that exceeded what formal religious education typically provided. As word spread through Redemption Creek about Luna's presence and her remarkable intelligence, the community began dividing into distinct factions with very different visions of how she should be integrated into their society. The progressive faction, led by Dr. Hartwell and Sarah McKenna, viewed Luna as an opportunity to expand their understanding of human potential and challenge conventional assumptions about civilization. The conservative faction, represented by some of the older settlers and more traditional business owners, saw Luna as a threat to social order and moral standards that needed to be contained and controlled rather than celebrated. They worried that accepting someone who had lived outside conventional moral boundaries would encourage others to question established authority and behavioral expectations. A third group, primarily composed of younger residents and those who had themselves experienced discrimination or hardship, viewed Luna as a symbol of individual freedom and self-determination that represented possibilities they had never considered for themselves. Her survival and apparent thriving outside conventional society suggested that alternative ways of living might be not only possible but superior to traditional arrangements. The tensions between these factions came to a head during Luna's first public appearance at the town's weekly community meeting. Sarah McKenna had convinced Luna to attend as a way of introducing herself to the broader community and demonstrating that she posed no threat to their safety or values. Luna's entrance into the meeting hall created a sensation that revealed just how deeply the community had been affected by stories and rumors about her existence. Some people stared with open fascination, others whispered nervously among themselves, and a few made obvious moves toward the exits as if her mere presence represented danger. But it was Luna's response to the community's scrutiny that surprised everyone present. Instead of the defensive or aggressive behavior they might have expected from someone raised by wolves, Luna demonstrated a dignity and composure that commanded respect even from those who had arrived prepared to condemn her. Luna knows people. Curious about women who lived with wolves, she began, her improving English carrying an authority that silenced the nervous chatter. Luna also curious about people who chose to live together in boxes made of wood and rules made of fear. Perhaps we can learn from each other instead of deciding one way is right and other way is wrong. The speech that followed challenged every assumption the townspeople had made about both Luna's capabilities and her intentions. She spoke about cooperation and mutual protection observed in Wolf society, about the importance of each individual finding their proper role within the community, and about the balance between personal freedom and collective responsibility. But Luna also addressed the fears and concerns that her presence had generated, acknowledging that her way of life represented a challenge to conventional assumptions, while promising that she had no intention of forcing others to adopt her values or abandon their own. The speech demonstrated political sophistication that many educated people would have struggled to achieve. The questions that followed Luna's presentation revealed the full spectrum of community attitudes toward her presence. Some inquiries focused on practical matters of how she had survived in the wilderness, while others probed her spiritual beliefs and moral philosophy. A few questioners were clearly attempting to trap her into saying something that could be used to justify rejecting her. It was old Henrik Larsson, the Norwegian immigrant who ran the town's blacksmith shop, who asked the question that cut to the heart of everyone's concerns. "Miss Luna, you've proven you can survive alone in conditions that would kill most of us. What we need to understand is whether you can live with other people without your independence threatening our security. Can wolves and sheep share the same pasture?" Luna's answer to Larsson's metaphorical question would determine whether she could find acceptance in Redemption Creek or would need to seek shelter elsewhere before winter made survival in the wilderness impossible. Henrik Larsson makes good tools because he understands that different metals become stronger when forged together. She replied thoughtfully. Luna thinks community like metal. Different people with different strengths can make everyone safer and more prosperous, but only if each person respected for what they contribute instead of feared for what they might take away. The response demonstrated Luna's understanding of both metallurgy and social dynamics, suggesting that her intelligence extended far beyond mere survival skills into areas that could benefit the entire community. But it also revealed her expectation that acceptance would be mutual, that she would be valued for her contributions rather than merely tolerated as charity case. As the meeting concluded and townspeople began filing out to discuss what they had heard, Luna found herself surrounded by a small group of residents who were eager to learn more about her experiences and perspectives. The enthusiasm of their questions and the respect they showed for her responses suggested that at least some members of the community were ready to embrace her as a neighbor rather than an exotic curiosity. But the real test of Luna's integration would come in the days that followed, as she attempted to find a sustainable role within the community that honored both her unique capabilities and the practical needs of frontier life. The winter that was rapidly approaching would provide the crucible in which her transformation from wolf woman to community member would either succeed or fail. Dr. Hartwell offered Luna a position assisting with medical care, recognizing that her knowledge of herbal remedies and wilderness survival could complement formal medical training in ways that might benefit everyone in the settlement. Sarah McKenna suggested that Luna could help teach wilderness skills to children whose safety might depend on such knowledge. But it was David Stormwind who proposed the solution that would ultimately define Luna's place in Redemption Creek society. Drawing on his experience moving between different worlds and cultures, he suggested that Luna could serve as a bridge between the settlement and the wider wilderness, using her unique understanding of both realms to benefit everyone who lived on the frontier. The proposal would transform Luna from an object of curiosity or concern into a valued community resource, whose skills and knowledge could help Redemption Creek thrive in an environment that had defeated many previous settlement attempts. But it would also require Luna to maintain connections to the wilderness that had shaped her while building new relationships with people who viewed that same wilderness as a threat to be conquered. As the first snow of winter began falling outside the clinic windows, Luna made the decision that would determine the course of her new life. She would attempt the most challenging transformation of all, becoming someone who could exist fully in both worlds without losing the essential qualities that had made survival possible in either. 5 years had passed since Luna first walked into Redemption Creek wrapped in wolf pelts and speaking in broken fragments of half-remembered English, and the transformation that had taken place defied every prediction that even her most optimistic supporters had made. The woman who now stood before the territorial legislature in Helena, dressed in a simple but elegant blue dress and speaking with the authority of someone who had earned respect through demonstrated competence, bore little resemblance to the wild creature David Stormwind had discovered by a spring in Devil's Gulch. Luna had become the unofficial wilderness guide and survival instructor for the entire Montana Territory, consulted by everyone from Army Scouts planning expeditions into unmapped regions to settlers preparing for the challenges of frontier life. Her unique combination of formal education, which she had pursued with remarkable dedication, and practical knowledge gained through years of wilderness survival, had created expertise that no university could duplicate. The legislative hearing, where Luna now testified, had been called to address the growing crisis of lost travelers and failed settlements in the territory's most challenging regions. Traditional approaches to frontier expansion had resulted in an unacceptable casualty rate, and territorial officials were finally ready to consider alternative strategies that incorporated indigenous knowledge and unconventional survival techniques. Honorable legislators, Luna began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate both wolf packs and political assemblies with equal skill. The wilderness is not an enemy to be conquered, but a teacher whose lessons can mean the difference between thriving communities and failed settlements that become graves for good people with inadequate preparation. Her presentation to the legislature drew on 5 years of experience helping establish successful settlements in regions where previous attempts had failed catastrophically. Luna's methods emphasized understanding and adapting to natural conditions rather than imposing preconceived solutions that ignored environmental realities. The success stories she recounted were impressive by any measure. The mining camp at Copper Falls had survived a brutal winter that would have killed everyone without Luna's guidance on food preservation and shelter construction. The farming community at Sweetwater had learned irrigation techniques that allowed them to prosper in an arid region where previous settlers had starved during drought years. But perhaps most remarkably, Luna had developed a network of communication and mutual aid between scattered settlements that had previously existed. In dangerous isolation, her ability to move safely through terrain that challenged experienced trackers allowed her to serve as a vital link between communities, carrying medical supplies to isolated homesteads and coordinating responses to emergencies that would have overwhelmed individual settlements. The transformation hadn't been easy or automatic. Luna's first winter in Redemption Creek had been marked by struggles that tested everyone's patience and commitment to the integration experiment. Her nightmares, triggered by memories of violence and loss that she had suppressed during her years of wilderness survival, had disrupted the boarding house for weeks until Dr. Hartwell developed a treatment approach that addressed trauma symptoms. Learning to navigate human social complexities had proven more challenging than mastering any wilderness survival skill. Luna's directness, shaped by years of living with creatures who never lied or manipulated, had initially created friction with townspeople accustomed to more subtle forms of communication. Understanding when honesty should be tempered with diplomacy had required patient coaching from Sarah McKenna. The economic integration had been equally complex. Luna's skills were undeniably valuable, but translating them into sustainable income within a cash-based economy had required creativity and flexibility from both Luna and the community that was learning to utilize her expertise. The solution had emerged gradually as Luna's reputation spread beyond Redemption Creek to attract clients willing to pay well for guidance that could save their lives. David Stormwind watched Luna's testimony from the legislative gallery with a mixture of pride and amazement at the journey they had all taken together. The woman addressing territorial officials with confidence and expertise was the same person who had once communicated primarily through growls and gestures, but the transformation went far deeper than acquired skills or conventional education. Luna had somehow managed to integrate the best qualities from both her worlds, retaining the heightened awareness and survival instincts that had kept her alive in the wilderness while developing the social and intellectual skills necessary for leadership. In human society, she had become something entirely new, a bridge between civilization and wildness that enriched both realms. The questions from legislators revealed both genuine interest in Luna's proposals and skepticism about methods that challenged conventional approaches to frontier development. Several representatives questioned whether techniques that worked for a uniquely gifted individual could be systematically applied to help ordinary settlers facing similar challenges. Luna's response demonstrated the teaching ability she had developed through years of training others in wilderness survival. Honorable Sir, every person has capacity to learn what Luna learned, because Luna is not special creature with magical powers. Luna is human being who survived by paying attention to what worked and what failed, by learning from mistakes instead of repeating them, and by understanding that cooperation produces better results than competition when facing life-threatening challenges. The detailed curriculum she presented for wilderness survival education impressed even the most skeptical legislators. Luna had systematically documented her knowledge into teachable modules that could be adapted for different regions and circumstances. Her methods emphasized observation and adaptation rather than rigid adherence to predetermined techniques. But the most compelling aspect of Luna's testimony was her proposal for establishing a territorial survival training center that would serve both settlers and military personnel. The facility would be located in terrain that provided access to diverse environmental challenges while remaining accessible enough for regular supply and communication. This center would not just teach survival techniques, Luna explained, but would develop new approaches to living safely and productively in regions that currently defeat most settlement attempts. Students would learn to read weather patterns, identify safe water sources, construct shelters appropriate for different conditions, and most importantly, understand how to work with natural systems instead of fighting against them. The economic arguments for Luna's proposal were as compelling as the humanitarian ones. Failed settlements represented enormous financial losses for investors and territorial development funds, while successful communities generated tax revenue and economic activity that benefited the entire territory. Reducing settlement failure rates through better preparation would pay for itself many times over. During a recess in the legislative session, Luna found herself surrounded by representatives who wanted more detailed information about specific aspects of her survival training program. The enthusiasm of their questions and the respect they showed for her expertise marked a complete transformation from the suspicion and hostility she had initially faced in Redemption Creek. It was during these informal discussions that Luna learned about a crisis that would provide the ultimate test of her integrated approach to wilderness survival and community building. A wagon train carrying 200 settlers had become stranded in the Burtooth Mountains, trapped by early snows that had closed the passes while they were still weeks away from their intended destination. The territorial governor, James Mitchell, approached Luna directly with a request that would challenge everything she had learned about balancing her dual nature. "Miss Luna, we need someone to reach those settlers before they all starve or freeze to death. The Army says the terrain is impassable, but you've proven that impossible conditions just require different approaches. Will you help us?" The rescue mission would require Luna to venture into conditions that would test her wilderness skills to their limits, but it would also involve coordinating with military and civilian authorities in ways that demanded sophisticated understanding of human organizational structures. It was exactly the kind of challenge that would demonstrate whether her transformation from wolf woman to community leader was complete. Luna's acceptance of the mission was immediate and unconditional. "Governor Mitchell, Luna will leave immediately with supplies and equipment needed for winter mountain rescue. But Luna requests permission to select her own team and use methods that may seem unconventional to military observers." The team Luna assembled reflected her understanding of what would be required for success in impossible conditions. David Stormwind would provide the cultural bridge between her wilderness methods and conventional rescue approaches. Dr. Hartwell would handle medical emergencies that were inevitable during winter mountain operations. Sarah McKenna would coordinate communications and logistics, but Luna also recruited team members whose inclusion surprised territorial officials. 3 former members of Morrison's hunting party, men who had once tried to kill her but had since become convinced of her value to the community, volunteered for the dangerous mission as a way of proving their redemption. Their wilderness experience, combined with their newfound respect for Luna's leadership, made them valuable additions despite their complicated history. The rescue expedition that departed Redemption Creek in November faced conditions that would have challenged the most experienced mountain men. Early winter storms had dumped unprecedented amounts of snow in the high country, creating avalanche conditions and temperatures that could kill unprotected humans in minutes. Luna's approach to the rescue mission incorporated lessons learned from both her wolf family and her human community. The team moved in small groups that could respond quickly to changing conditions, maintained constant communication through signals that worked in extreme weather, and established supply caches that would support extended operations when they finally reached the stranded wagon train after 6 days of travel through terrain that had defeated Army rescue attempts. The scene that greeted them was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The settlers had survived impossible conditions through cooperation and determination that reminded Luna of the pack mentality that had kept her alive during her wilderness years. But survival and rescue were different challenges that required different skills. Moving 200 people, including children and elderly individuals, through mountain terrain in winter conditions would demand coordination and leadership abilities that Luna had never needed during her solitary survival years. The solution she developed drew on every aspect of her unique background and training. Luna organized the settlers into family groups that could support each other like wolf packs, assigned responsibilities based on individual strengths rather than conventional roles, and established movement patterns that minimized exposure to the most dangerous conditions. The month-long evacuation that followed became legendary throughout the Montana Territory as an example of what could be accomplished when wilderness knowledge was combined with human cooperation and determination. Luna's team successfully guided all 200 settlers to safety without losing a single life, despite facing conditions that would normally have guaranteed massive casualties. The success of the Beartooth rescue mission established Luna's reputation as the foremost wilderness survival expert in the American West. But more importantly, it demonstrated that her transformation from wolfwoman to community leader was not just complete, but had created something entirely new and valuable. When Luna returned to Redemption Creek after the rescue mission, she found a community that had been transformed by her example as much as she had been changed by their acceptance. The town had become a center for wilderness education and frontier development, attracting students and clients from across the territory who came to learn survival skills and innovative approaches to frontier living. The school that Luna established in an expanded facility outside town became the model for similar institutions throughout the West. Students learned not just practical survival techniques, but also the philosophical approaches that had allowed Luna to thrive in conditions that defeated others. They studied cooperation as well as competition, adaptation as well as conquest. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Luna's transformation was her ability to help others who had been damaged by frontier violence and trauma. Her unique understanding of both survival and recovery made her an invaluable resource for people struggling to rebuild their lives after devastating experiences. The children who learned wilderness skills from Luna carried her integrated approach into their adult lives, becoming leaders who understood both the demands of civilization and the lessons of the natural world. They founded communities that prospered in challenging environments while maintaining respect for the ecosystems that supported them. David Stormwind, watching Luna teach a group of children how to read weather patterns from the behavior of birds, reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them all to this point. The woman who had once crouched naked beside a spring, drinking like the wolves that had raised her, had become someone who could address territorial legislatures and organize complex rescue missions while never losing the essential wildness that made her wisdom unique. As winter settled over Redemption Creek in Luna's 6th year as a community member, she found herself facing a question that would have been impossible to answer during her early years of integration. A messenger arrived from the territorial capital with news that the federal government was establishing a new position, Director of Frontier Survival Education for the Department of the Interior. The position would require Luna to move to Washington and work with officials who had never experienced frontier conditions, but were responsible for policies that affected thousands of settlers. It represented the ultimate test of whether someone who had learned humanity from wolves could navigate the most civilized corridors of power. Luna's decision would determine not just her own future, but the broader question of whether wildness and civilization could truly be integrated in ways that enriched both. As she stood on the hill overlooking Redemption Creek, watching smoke rise from chimneys of homes where families lived safely because of her teachings, Luna understood that she had found her true calling. The woman who had once been raised by wolves had become the teacher who could help humanity remember the wisdom that civilization had forgotten. Her journey from the caves of Devil's Gulch to the halls of power in Washington would carry forward the essential lesson that survival and prosperity came not from conquering the wilderness, but from learning to live within it, as wolves had taught her to do. On a clear morning in spring, as Luna prepared to leave Redemption Creek for her new position in the nation's capital, she visited the cemetery where the alpha wolf who had been her father was buried beside the human families who had become her pack. The flowers she placed on both graves carried the same message. Family was not defined by blood or species, but by the willingness to protect and care for one another regardless of the cost. The legacy Luna left behind in Redemption Creek would continue long after her departure, carried forward by students who understood that the strongest communities were those that honored both the wildness that created resilience and the civilization that enabled cooperation. Her story had become proof that transformation was possible for anyone willing to embrace the best qualities of every world they encountered.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.